Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. I want to say first of all that I'm really excited about this program, and I'm not sure anybody else around me at this point is. So it's my job to kind of sell this as being exciting. I hope you find the same thing to be true. What I want to talk about is what it means to be self-contradictory or self-refuting. I know you're not excited either, but I hope you will be by the time we get into this. There are several different ways to approach apologetics, which is, of course, what I do. And just make sure everybody knows, apologetics is actually a Bible word, but it's a Greek Bible word. It comes from the Greek word apologia, which is in 1 Peter 3:15, which means to give a reasonable answer. So what we try to do with Church for Skeptics is talk to skeptical people. I think I recommend being skeptical. Not being a skeptic, but being skeptical. Big difference. And so we try to give reasonable answers to some of the objections to Christianity. And we've been talking a lot about faith and doubt. Well, this program is sort of dedicated to asking the skeptics to doubt their doubts. And I actually had a lady one time years ago say that's exactly what happened to her. She came as an atheist, doubted all her doubts, later became a believer, and is still involved in a church, as far as I know. The traditional way to do apologetics is to give evidence, it makes sense. We give evidence and arguments for, let's say, the existence of God. There are traditional historical arguments for God's existence, and I think they're very persuasive. The one from just the idea of where the universe came from somebody or something outside the universe, God's a primary candidate. The argument from design, if the universe looks designed, it probably is. The argument from morality, it's really hard to establish or ground the idea of morality or right and wrong without there being a God, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. But there's a second way of doing this. Of course, history is a primary way of giving evidence for the truth of Christianity. There's another way, though, that I've gravitated towards. In addition, I hope I don't want to use one or the other. Every system of beliefs, every worldview, every pattern of beliefs that people have, we all do this. We take some things for granted without feeling the need to argue for their validity. For example, the rules of logic. Most everybody that tries to make a case for anything takes for granted that logic, the rules of logic, are true. They don't have to argue for those things. They're just sort of what the Declaration would have called self-evident. We hold these truths to be self-evident. We don't have to argue for them. Everybody knows them. We call those things presuppositions. And from these presuppositions, then, whatever they are, for whatever worldview we're examining, conclusions are drawn. So this second approach to apologetics is called, actually, presuppositional apologetics or worldview apologetics. So it asks the question. I'll try to do this a couple ways, and you might not really get into this until I start giving examples. Can the presuppositions be true in a certain worldview if the conclusions are also true? Or can the conclusions be true given the presuppositions that got you to those conclusions? What it all boils down to is this. It boils down to coherence. All truth has to be coherent. All truth has to live in the same reality. Right? And so that's the foundation for presuppositional apologetics. Every worldview will answer, like, why do we care? Why do we want to know any worldview? Why do we adopt any philosophy or any religion? Well, there are basically four questions that are so basic to our human experience. I think every worldview has an answer for them. The first one is origins. Where did we come from? Where did all this come from? Why is there something rather than nothing is the most basic philosophical question. Well, every worldview has a story to tell about that. Materialism would say we came from nothing, by nothing, for no reason. But that's still an answer to that question of where do we come from. The second question that we want to know is, and everybody wants to know this, is there any meaning to my existence? Is there a reason for me to be here? Or am I just an accident? That's a really basic question that affects the way we live. If I'm here for a purpose beyond something that I can design for myself, I need to respond to that. If I'm here just by accident and I can make it up as I go along, hey, then let's do it that way. But it's a very basic question. The third question that everybody wants to know is there a certain way I should live? What does morality mean? Or am I responsible to something other than myself or somebody other than myself or other people, or am I even responsible to them, or can I even be responsible? Do I have free will to make decisions? All those questions involve morality. Is there a way I should live? And then the final question, and atheists and everybody else have an answer for it, where am I going? What's my destiny? So think about it. Origins, meaning, morality, and destiny. Those are the big four questions that every worldview answers. But there's something else. There also are some requirements, and just to make it 4 and 4, there are 4 requirements that I think I should be able to ask of any worldview, including my own. I should, for a worldview to be relevant to me, to be, okay, I might consider that, at least 4 things ought to be true. Number 1, I ought to require a worldview to be what I would call correspondent. Now, I use that word because it's a philosophical term that talks about the correspondence theory of truth. Truth has to correspond to reality. That's almost like the same thing. To say reality, what's real, what's true, we're saying the same thing. So a worldview has to correspond with me, with my experience. If I'm totally deceived about every single thing in my experience, then I could never know what's true anyway. So I'm going to ask that every worldview that I consider is going to have to correspond in some way to my human experience. The second requirement that I would make is livability. This is a big one. Can I live as if my worldview is true? Can I live that way? That's one of my real, and I'm not going to get into this deeply today, it's one of my real problems with materialism. If materialism is true, free will doesn't exist because matter doesn't make decisions. If we're nothing but an accumulation of atoms and molecules, we're not making decisions. We're just responding by natural law to whatever happens, our environment. Well, if that's true, I don't really make decisions. Well, I cannot live, and I don't think anybody can live as if I don't have free will. Everybody lives consciously and subconsciously as if they have free will. So livability. The third one, I'll put it down on the list a little bit, is we go back up to the first way to do apologetics. Third one, there ought to be some evidence. If my worldview is true, there ought to be some evidence to support it. Now, there's a lot of evidence out there, a lot of facts out there that can support varying worldviews, but my worldview that I embrace ought to have evidence behind it. There ought to be some good, logical, positive reason for me to believe that. The fourth one is the one that I want to investigate today. It's coherence. Is it self-contradicting? If there's a contradiction between my presuppositions, the things I take for granted, and my conclusions, they won't fit in the same box. They're self-contradictory. Then my worldview cannot be true, because true by definition is coherent. I'll explain it with a great illustration. When I was a kid, I read this book called Inside Baseball. I loved baseball when I was a kid, still do, even though I don't play it anymore. So here's a baseball story. Guy hits a great base hit and goes to first base. This actually happened. I don't remember the names, but this is like 1920s professional baseball, which is my favorite era. Second guy up hits a great hit, goes deep in the outfield. The guy on first takes off around second and heads towards third. The guy that hits it rounds first and just heads for second. But the throw from the outfield comes to the third base guy. So the guy that's going to third comes back around. He turns around and goes back to second. So you got a guy coming towards second base from the first base side, a guy coming towards second base from the third base side, and they both slide into the same base. Great slides. Tag is missed. Except they get up, and the veteran is the guy who made the second hit. The rookie's the guy who came back to the base after he'd already crossed it. And the guy looks at him, and he says, "That was a great slide, kid, but one of us is out." In other words, you can't have two guys on the same base. They don't fit. One of them's out. Well, that's what self-contradiction means. You can't have the same two truth claims, in the same box. They don't work. That's self-contradictory. Now, still, here's where it's going to start fitting into you, I think. You need examples. And there are a couple of ways in which things can become self-contradictory. Here's one. No sentence is longer than 3 words. Do I have to explain that? I hope not. That's self-contradictory. It can't possibly be true. No sentence is longer. Why? I just refuted myself by making the statement. How about this? If you say it in English, I cannot speak one word of English. Self-contradictory, right? Here's another one that's getting a little more on the philosophical edge. I do not exist. Okay, who made the statement then? So I hope you understand. This is like getting into a little bit of what it means to be self-contradicting. Self-contradicting or self-refuting worldviews contradict themselves as they are explained. Now we're starting to get into the meat of this. So one of the most popular worldviews of our day is what we generally call relativism. All truth is relative or subjective. So truth is subjective, which means, if it is subjective, it means it's subject to the person making the statement. So I say Christianity is true, and you say, well, it's true for you. It's subject to the person making the statement, which is, it's not the nature of truth. Truth is not subject to the person making the statement. Truth is what's true no matter who says it or doesn't say it. Truth is true no matter who believes it or doesn't believe it. That's the nature of truth. So how do I show that all truth is relative, is self-contradictory? I just ask a simple question. Is that true? Well, if it is, you've just refuted, you've contradicted what you just said. If all truth is relative and you make that as an objectively true, absolutely true statement, you've just refuted your own self. They won't fit on the same base. You got two base runners on the same base here. It doesn't work. Here's another one. Morality is just a personal opinion. So it's wrong for you to pass judgment on someone else's behavior. Why is that self-refuting? Because that's what you just did. In other words, if I'm making the statement and I say morality is just personal opinion anyway, so it's wrong for you to pass your judgment on somebody else's behavior. Well, I've just made a moral statement against what your behavior is. At the same time, I've denied that you should pass judgment on somebody else's behavior. But I just did that on your behavior. And so what I want to say is this, and this is the big deal. Like you say, well, yeah, that's just the way the world is today. Yes. But that means that relativism cannot possibly be true. And it goes back to nobody can live as if it's true. Nobody can live as if all truth is relative. Nobody can live as if morality is nothing but a personal opinion. And so it fails the test of a worldview on 2 levels. It's not coherent, self-contradictory, and it's not livable. So it seems to me the best thing to do is to go back to the drawing board, if that's your worldview. I want to say another word, and maybe this will be a little edgy, on the idea of all morality is relative, so it's wrong for you to pass judgment on somebody else's behavior. That's not only self-refuting, but it's really, and you think about our culture today, it's a really big deal. And what it ends up being, I think it's not only self-refuting, but it's very dangerous. And here's why I think that. It becomes intolerant in the name of tolerance. So what we like to do is redefine the word tolerant to mean you never disagree in it with anybody, because all truth's relative. But if you disagree with somebody, especially if it's something that's important to them, usually in the area of morality. If you disagree with someone, that's been redefined as being intolerant. Well, everybody knows intolerance is wrong. So even though you've said morality's up for grabs, you've grabbed onto the morality of tolerance, but you become intolerant in your application of it. So what happens is it becomes the ones who are in power are the ones enforcing those rules of intolerance. The minority report is not allowed anymore. Well, that sounds like what happened in Nazi Germany, what happened in communist Russia in the revolution, because it is. In Islamic countries today, it is forbidden to criticize anything about Islam. We know that's intolerant, but in their view, it's intolerant to criticize. And in our country, in our culture, it's getting to the same point. Well, what happens is you end up losing the ability to have rational discourse and discussions. And I think for that reason, that is not only self-contradictory, but it's dangerous as well. Here's another one that comes right off the heels of that, but it's a very popular worldview today. Every college campus, postmodernism. Postmodernism, it's hard to pin down because it's basically a reaction against every worldview that's come before it. Because most every worldview that's come before it thought it was right. I'd much rather talk to an atheist than a postmodernist. An atheist thinks he knows the truth and Christianity is not it. Okay, we can have a discussion then. We tolerate each other, we can be cordial to each other, but we can have a discussion. We can disagree because he thinks he knows the truth. I think I know what's true, and we can discuss it. Postmodernist says all the violence of the first 20 centuries has been so bad because people thought they knew the truth. So let's get rid of truth altogether, and we'll cut out all the violence and all the harm that's been done to the world because people thought what they believed were true. And so here's the number one statement of postmodernism: every truth claim is a grab for power, and that's all it is. Now, remember earlier I said there are two ways for something to become self-contradictory or self-refuting. The first way is as you define the worldview itself, it just contradicts itself. It becomes self-refuting. There's another way for a worldview to be self-refuting, and this is postmodernism. That's when the speaker himself, whoever's making the statement, has to assume a position that he doesn't think exists, or that his worldview says doesn't exist. He's the exception to his own rule. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So, if somebody says all truth claims are nothing but a grab for power, my question to him is, what about didn't you just make a truth claim that all truth claims are nothing but a grab for power? Well then, if that's true, what you just said is nothing but your grab for power. Why should I pay any attention to it at all? Of course I shouldn't, if what he says is true. And in this case, it's not that so much as that it's already self-refuting, so why should I pay any attention to it? If it's self-refuting, it can't possibly be true. Truth is just non-negotiable. The law of non-contradiction, which is what this whole thing's based on, is the second law of logic, and it's not negotiable. If you say, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, you've just used it to make that statement. Two things can't be true at the same time. So if it's wrong, it's not right. If it's right, it's not wrong. That's simple. We use that every day, all day. We just don't define it in those formal terms. Now let me tell you another example of the exception to the rule here. I've used this before, but it just fits so well here. I call it the elephant in the room. A very popular Hindu parable. And the parable is designed to show that all truth is relative, that nobody has a full picture of the truth, and we're all of us are like the 6 blind men who encountered an elephant. Now this is usually told in Eastern countries, in pantheistic worldview countries, and they tell it a lot. So 6 blind men encounter an elephant, and one of the blind men grabs the leg and says, "This is a tree. This is a tree, no two ways about it." Another one grabs the tail and says, "You're crazy, it's not a tree, this is a rope." Another one grabs the trunk and says, "It's not a tree or a rope, it's a huge snake." Another one somehow gets up on top and feels the back and says, "You're all wrong. This is a table." I don't know if I got that 6 or not, but for the sake of time, I'll stop there. The point of the parable is nobody has the truth. They all have their own perceptions, and that's all they have. And that sounds so good, doesn't it? Until you realize that's totally self-contradictory. Why? Because the guy telling the story knows it's an elephant. He's not blind. And it's an elephant. There's an elephant in the room, the truth in the room. He has to assume a position to tell the parable that the parable says doesn't exist. It's like this. He's his own self-refutation. That's true with postmodernism. The speaker has to be the exception. It's true with any kind of relativism. The speaker has to be the exception. One more popular, though understated, worldview. And what I'm saying is, it seems to me, if I can show, or if I realize myself that these things are self-contradictory, I just can't embrace them as being true. How about this one? The only way to know anything is through the scientific method, or maybe just science. Now, this is not usually stated that out in the open, but it's implied in a lot of things. If it's not scientific, I don't believe it. Why do you think, by the way, it just struck me today. You know, Sam Harris, I think, is probably the best well-spoken atheist on the planet, at least that I know of. Maybe there are others. And his big claim to fame is that he believes in objective morality, but he believes that it has to be learned through science, and he has a long way to go around about that. But why take morality and try to turn it into a science? Because the world is hooked on science. Now, science is awesome. I mean, everybody is blessed by science every day. So the idea that the only way we can know truth is through science is really, even though it's understated, it's a very popular view. The problem is it's self-defeating. If it's self-defeating, you have to throw it out. Why is it self-defeating? Let me make the statement again. The only way we can really know if something is true or not is by the scientific method. Is that a scientific statement? Did I learn that how could you possibly learn that from science? What experiment in the scientific method could you possibly do to show that the only way to learn anything is through science? The truth is, it's not a scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement. Being a philosophical statement, you can't be the exception to your own rule. So if you can learn that science is the only way to learn something through philosophy, then science is not the only way you can learn something to be true. And it self-refutes, it self-destructs. By the way, that view has been around for a long time, and the reason it's understated now is because even in philosophical circles, in the 1920s, it was called logical positivism. Now, that's a big word. But all it means is this: only statements that can be verified by empirical observation have meaning. So statements like, God loves you, has no meaning. It's the same as me saying blah, 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 blah. How about this one? Rape is morally wrong. Well, you cannot confirm that through scientific observation, so it's meaningless under logical positivism. So it's just like saying, for me, saying rape is morally wrong is just like saying blah, 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 blah. It has no meaning at all. Well, the only problem with it is somebody finally pointed out, I don't know why they didn't do this on day one, that's self-refuting, because the statement is not empirically verifiable that the only way that can be meaningful is through empirical observation. That statement in itself violates itself. It's self-refuting. It's self-contradicting. I'll give you one last illustration here, which is my favorite. To say that science is the only way we can know anything is not only self-refuting, it's self-contradictory, but it's also pretty narrow. Science, by definition, is what we call methodologically natural. In other words, science is in the business of looking for natural explanations for physical events and physical things. Okay, no problem there. But science in scientism has become what's called metaphysically naturalistic. In other words, if science can't find it, it doesn't exist. What? If science can't see it, it doesn't exist. What? Alvin Plantinga, the great Christian philosopher, says it's like this. A drunk on Saturday night downtown loses his car keys, and he insists on looking under the street lamp for those car keys and no place else. Why? Because the light's better there. And it's worse than that. Not only does he insist on only looking under the street lamp because the light's better, he insists that that's the only place the keys can possibly be because the light's better there. That's a pretty good illustration of what it means to be self-contradicting, and it's a pretty good illustration of the failure of scientism. The only way we can learn anything is through science. To go back over some of these things, to be self-refuting either means that it's, when you explain it, it destroys itself, it refutes itself, it can't possibly be true. Or to be self-refuting means that you have to adopt a position. It's like this. Let me explain it one last way. Maybe the physical illustration. So I climb the tree of reason, I'll say, and I sit on the branch of logic to espouse my belief that materialism is true, that the only thing that exists in the universe is matter. I'm matter, you're matter, the trees matter. Nothing exists except physical objects, things that can be weighed and measured. Well, how did you come to that position? Well, I climbed the tree of reason and logic, and I'm sitting on this branch. But my conclusion that nothing exists except matter means that the branch doesn't exist and the tree doesn't exist. How much does logic weigh? For that matter, how much does a thought weigh? If your conclusions cannot possibly be true according to the way you said you got to those conclusions, your presuppositions, then your conclusions are wrong or your presuppositions are wrong. Time to go back to the laboratory. This hasn't had a lot to do with Christianity in the sense, except to say this in conclusion, I think Christianity passes this test with flying colors. It is livable, it is coherent, it has great evidence supporting it, and it corresponds to the human experience. I'm a person because I'm made by a person. I have free will because my Creator has free will. I can reason because my Creator is reasonable. I think that's the best explanation. It's rational inference. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope this helped. Keep watching.